Thank you very much. Thank you, Rudiger. Right. Everything you ever wanted to know about licensing but were afraid to ask, part one starts here. There aren't going to be ice creams between the parts, I'm afraid, not on this particular occasion. It's an all the way through film. So, this is not easy, this licensing data sharing thing, first thing to say. It's a complex thing, which of course is why it's subject of part of the INSPIRE directive. And has taken us quite a long time to get to where we are. But what I want to do just now is just give you the context. Some of you in the room will know better than I do what I'm about to tell you, but it just sets the scene for what it is that some of the examples you're going to hear about later are trying to achieve. So I'm going to tell you what INSPIRE actually says about sharing, what you have to do, and then moving on from where we have been, talking about sharing data into sharing services. So sharing has, means different things to different people. Some people seem to think it's about sharing protected data, some it's about having a common data repository, others it means business relationships. INSPIRE actually in various places refers to all three of those things, but primarily it's around the business relationships involved in transferring data and services from one party to another party. And where it falls is in chapter 5, for those who are familiar with the text of the directive, into two areas. The first one is all about what we do within our own member states and between them. And the second bit is all about this very specific case about how we in public authorities and member states share data with the community institutions and bodies. And that is about bringing forward the actual regulation. So the regulation is only about sharing with the community institution bodies. Just by way of illustration, of course, every member state has to share data at the national level, it shares at the local level and between, and so do the community institutions, and of course everyone may have a need to share with each other. Now the bits that are flashing there, that bit, the green bit, is the bit that the directive is concerned with. The blue bit is the bit that the Commission themselves are concerned with, and they are not they're not obligated under the directive, but they have said that they will adopt the same rules as the member states. And the red bit in the middle is the bit that the regulation is concerned with. Of course, the picture isn't quite that simple. There's other bodies, there's international bodies, there's pan-European bodies, and now we've got things like national contact points and geoportals popping in at the higher level. So it is a very complex picture. Just to give you a slight quick guide to the actual documentation, the directive, as far as the red bit, that's the bit in the middle, that is put in place through the regulation. And to support that is the guidance on the regulation. The green bit, that's the bit between the member states, is put in place legally through national transposed legislation. And to help you on that one, we've got the good practice guide. So, what do you actually have to do? Now looking at the regulation, this is the supply of data and services from member state public authorities to the community institutions and bodies. This is essentially what the regulation says. It's fairly limited in what it's asking you to do, and a lot of it is about giving extra information as opposed to the actual conditions of the transfer of data or services. But the two things I draw your attention to is the definitions laid down in the directive have to be the same, and the idea of that is that we're actually talking about the same things at the same time. And down at the bottom you'll see one about 20 days after receipt, which sounds a little odd if you're talking about services. Everything should be online, shouldn't it? But this is referring to the situation before the service is in place as well as after, so it obviously has to include something that's reasonable when there is no service to deliver. The regulation also includes a couple of things that the community institutions are going to do, which, given that the regulation actually applies to member states, slightly odd, but it is written into the regulation that they will do this. And that, of course, applies without any transposition. When? Well, now, effectively. If you've got regulations, or not regulations, sharing agreements with the Commission, then it applies from October last year. So what you have to do, if you've already got some arrangement whereby you supply a community institution and body with data, then you have to bring it into compliance by April next year. And if you haven't, but you are asked to provide data, then you have to put in place something that's compliant straight away. And that was the case ever since October last year. Now, going to the green bit, this is the bit about sharing data within and between member states and international bodies. And those of you who might have attended a presentation at last year's Inspire conference might recognise the 10 commandments of this. This is what the directive says, which in turn should be transposed into your national legislation, although of course it may not actually say that in these words. There's quite a lot there, and there's quite a lot open into interpretation. As for when this has to be done, well, it didn't have a date, which meant that it applied from when the directive came into force, which was 2009, which means it's effective now. So, what do you have to do towards that one? Well, if you have data sharing arrangements with any other public authorities, you have to review them to see if they meet those 10 commandments. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail on that at the moment, but we can certainly discuss that later if anybody wants to. Is there any help? Well, there is some help that's been provided partly by the drafting team that I'm involved with. The first is some guidance on the regulation, and that has a number of concepts in it, the most important of which is that there's a preference for what we've called upstream framework agreements, the idea being that you put in place the arrangement for supply of the data before the data is actually needed. And the agreement applies to a grouping of authorities. Also, if you do need to use a transactional license, then we've put in two template ones, the basic one and the specific one. The basic one applying to a situation where there's very few restrictions on the data and there's no charging involved, and the specific one is a modular approach to a situation where something else is applying. And the other things that are important to make this whole thing work, of course, is coordination to make sure that you know what licenses apply where, and transparency in terms of what those licenses actually mean. And the second piece of guidance that's out there is a thing called the Good Practice Guide. And the way we've tackled that is to look at these topics, which we think are the important topics that relate to data and service sharing. And for each one, we've got criteria as to what makes a good example of these. There's a couple of, that's the framework agreements one, there's licenses. So that's what we'd be expecting to see in an example of good practice in licensing. We can perhaps compare that one later, what we're going to see. And now for each one, rather than repeat information that's available elsewhere, what we've done is simply condensed it into some metadata about the example, some general context which describes it in very few words, what it's all about, and importantly, what it is about it that makes it, that ticks those boxes, that meets those criteria that we just saw, and where to find more information. Now, that's a wordle of the guidance to the regulation. Now, what word stands out most to you there? Data, by any chance? Even more so on the Good Practice Guide. Data. That's what these two documents are really focused on. And I think this is symptomatic of the way some of the thinking was going when we were writing these documents. We were really looking at data and licensing of data rather than the services delivering it. And it's that sort of shift as more and more services come online that we're now having to tackle and realise that we need to give more guidance on. So the Commission has asked us to revise the guidance, and we're doing that in two ways. Firstly, we put a consultation out last year, which I'm sure some of you responded to, and thank you very much. And we've got comments back from that, which we've put into the guidance already to a certain extent. But more important, well, not more importantly, but as importantly, we're trying to extend the guidance to be more about sharing services as well as about sharing data. Now, it is a work in progress. We are working. We're even meeting on Tuesday this week, and hope to have something for you by the end of the calendar year. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing, though, the new topics we're hoping to introduce into the guidance are access management, something on service levels and performance. And of course, the basic and specific licenses that I referred to are fairly data-based licenses, although in many cases it actually says data and service, but it's not that explicitly about services. So we're trying to take a modular approach there and say there's certain bits that apply always to a data license, there's certain bits that will always apply to a service license, and some that will apply to one that's about both. So it's going to be a bit of a pick and mix approach. We are going to retain, though, where we can, the idea of having a core to a module and then optional parts, which is the same idea as we had on the basic and specific licenses. So that's a sort of little sight of what you can probably expect to see coming from the revised guidance later this year. In doing it, just by way of comment, we've had a look at a number of different service agreements to pick out what's good about them. And we've looked at 11, and interestingly, perhaps, or perhaps not, if you knew this already, more than half of them have got some form of restriction in the use of that service. More than half don't allow unprotected access to the service, and most of them distinguish between different users or usages of the service. And I think it's quite significant that that is the case, because it just suggests to me that there's an increasing need for management of rights and licenses, which is, of course, why we're all here today. But that's certainly coming out of those service agreements. We would, of course, love any other good practice examples or any examples of these sorts of service arrangements. So if anyone has any, do please have a word with me, either during the workshop or afterwards. But it's difficult, and it's more difficult than giving things away often, is to license them and manage the use of them. So I'm hoping to find out just how we can make it easier in the course of the workshop. So thank you very much.